So, Widge, are you here?
Yes, I'm still here.
Oh, Widge is still here. So let me introduce Widge, William Baldridge. He's in Virginia now, but Widge and I just met fairly recently in 2020 online, Facebook and so forth. And Widge has taken this series as well. But Widge is an old TM teacher from the 1970s, and I didn't know Widge from the 1970s. He was on the West Coast, I was on the East Coast, and I didn't know any of the teachers on the West Coast. Widge also attended the 30th November talk, and I guess we met briefly there, but there were so many people there, and I was organizing. I didn't, you know, I'm always apologetic to Widge for not remembering that we had a brief conversation there, but we've had many conversations since, and we're friends now. But as of 2020, Widge told me this story that he's going to tell you. Go ahead, Widge.
Okay, great. Yeah, so the story is, and it's one that I've remembered real clearly, and I'll explain why. The story is that a number of us were, so the TM movement was founded by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. He started a college called Maharishi International University. The first class was in 1973, in the fall of 1973, and I was there. It was in Santa Barbara, California. It was just off campus from UCSB in Goleta, Isla Vista, California, and wasn't too far from Los Angeles, right? Santa Barbara's not too far from LA. So a handful of my friends would drive down to Los Angeles once a week for TM lectures by a leader of a part of the TM organization called the Spiritual Regeneration Movement. Most everybody was involved in TM through the International Meditation Society or Students International Meditation Society. But in LA, there was a component of the TM movement called the Spiritual Regeneration Movement. And a gentleman named Charlie Lutes ran it. And Charlie Lutes would have weekly meetings and would answer questions and talk about things that others wouldn't talk about. For instance, reincarnation and angels and heaven and things like that. That was sort of those were taboo topics more or less in TM. They just wanted to get the teaching of TM out. They didn't want to get, off into some of those other issues. And so people would go down to LA to hear these lectures from Charlie Lutes to get more understanding of these other topics, such as reincarnation. So returning to Santa Barbara following one of those weekly lectures, my friends reported that someone had asked specific questions about reincarnation concerning individuals who were around Jesus when Jesus was alive. So to my great surprise, my friends reported that Charlie Lutes said that some of the personalities around Jesus back then are alive again today and are associated with the TM organization. I found that kind of shocking. To my greater surprise, Mr. Lutes cited an example of one such individual who had lived and worked with Jesus while Jesus was on earth, Simon Peter, also known as St. Peter. This surprised me a great deal, so I never forgot it. The reason it surprised me is that I understood traditional Hindu dogma, and I knew that according to Hindu dogma, saints don't reincarnate. Once you get to you evolve to this state of sainthood, supposedly, you do not reincarnate. So I was really shocked that Charlie Lutes was saying that Simon Peter or Saint Peter not only had reincarnated, but was with us today. He went on to say that he had also, that the same soul had also had other significant lifetimes, plural, including one as a very great political and military leader, specifically Frederick the Great. Again, this was sort of mind-blowing to me as a Christian because I had a great deal of veneration and respect for St. Peter, but understood what was thought to be known about reincarnation at that time, which was that saints don't reincarnate, much less reincarnate as a political and military leader out bashing people's heads in from time to time. So this really stuck in my memory because it was in huge conflict with other things that I thought were true. So it stood out as a huge series of question marks for me. So from 1973 until the present, a somewhat small number of us had learned from Charlie Lutes, who to us remains a very reliable source on these kinds of matters, that St. Peter had also lived a life as Frederick the Great and was currently a TM teacher in the TM organization. Now, keep in mind from earlier things Kelvin had said today, in 1973, Kelvin didn't even really believe in reincarnation, right? He wasn't, this was not something that really interested him. So back in February of 2020, once I'd sort of started discussing this with Kelvin, he was shocked. And I went back to check my memory of this with my sort of best friend at the time, who I hung out with all the time at MIU in Santa Barbara, James in Arkansas, to confirm that my memory of these matters going back to 1973 were correct. And James remembered all the details the same way I do. I had just assumed that from that point onward, from 1973 onward, the individual in question knew very well who he was and simply, wished to keep his identity from being known publicly or even known inside the TM organization. So it was with total surprise that I discovered that this individual, who was indeed a TM teacher in the TM organization back in 1973, had not known of his life as Simon Peter until 1977, nor had he had any intimation of his life of Frederick the Great until 1979, and is indeed today Kelvin Chin. Conversely, Kelvin was very surprised to learn that a handful of other MIU students and myself in Santa Barbara had been aware since 1973 of the fact that Simon Peter and Frederick the Great were but two separate lifetimes of the same soul or personality, who, like many of us, had become a TM teacher. It's very interesting to note that Kelvin had not determined which Prussian king he had been until late 2014. Whereas, in 1973, Charlie Lutes had been very clear that Simon Peter, St. Peter, and Frederick the Great were the same soul and was alive and toiling along with the rest of us as a TM teacher at the time. So yeah, that was an amazing thing. I had no idea that Kelvin didn't know back then of his prior lives. So that's kind of my story. Any questions or clarifications on that?
Oh, that's great, Widge. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, so that all happened. That conversation with Widge and me, that's 2020.
Yeah,
that just happened last year, beginning of last year. So, because here's the thing, let me say this to you guys as a teaching point. I'm a skeptic too. I mean, I'm like walking around thinking, am I making this stuff up? Am I, watch too many sci-fi movies? Like, what am I remembering here? Whatever, and yet some of these little data points keep popping up. And then this most recent one from last year with Widge and so forth was quite frankly the most dramatic one, because Widge and I didn't even know each other really until last year, etc. And I never met Charlie Lutes. I knew who he was. I never heard any of his lectures. Quite frankly, I wasn't interested in his stuff because he was talking about angels and past lives and stuff. And I was in the science, business, college student end of the organization. We were teaching business people, professional athletes, and we were all about the scientific research, about the meditation and so forth, and teaching in college campuses and stuff. So Charlie Lutes, as Widge described, was in a different arm, and I had nothing to do with it. Zero, nothing to do with the spiritual side until something opened up in me, just completely spontaneously. So there you go. Thank you, Widge. Thanks for that. That's a letter that Widge wrote that I'm going to put in my last book, in which he describes the what he just said. That's a picture of me teaching in the catacombs, probably around 60 AD, approximately.